Hello, friends. Good evening. Good evening and welcome. It's good to see many familiar faces. My name is Jamie Boskett. I have the privilege of serving as the president and CEO of your Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and I'm thrilled on behalf of our colleagues to welcome you this evening to a very special lecture for a whole variety of reasons, including, of course, that we have one of our own speaking this evening. I hope it's okay, Nelson, that I describe it as such, and you'll understand if you don't already as I proceed with my introduction. I'm going to share a few announcements and also introduce our distinguished speaker, and this will be a perfect time, if you would please, to turn off anything that might make noise. Power down those cell phones. There have been two really exciting announcements that have come out from the VMHC in the past week and a half, and I thought I'd share a little more with you this evening. Of course, both of the announcements have much to do with our leading efforts to commemorate America's 250th, and of course, that is now just, 6+ months away, believe it or not. You've been hearing me talk about this for some time, and for good reason, but now the moment has arrived. The first announcement, I should have it here, is, and I hope if you don't already have one, you should collect one this evening. This is the brand new Virginia 250 passport. The VMHC has led an effort, one of the largest efforts ever, to coordinate our peer institutions in the Commonwealth to encourage people to embrace their history and engage with their local and regional history museums as we march forward to America's semi-quincentennial. This little booklet seems like a simple exercise, but I promise you it was not a simple exercise to wrangle 70 different history museums spanning the entirety of the Commonwealth, including all those you would expect, like Mount Vernon and Monticello and Colonial Williamsburg and others. But I'm proud to say that the VMHC is the convener of these institutions and the one who is able to organize in short order this effort. And we have now distributed 250,000 passports across the Commonwealth. And also, I would tell you that just today, a member of our team, because you take the passport, you go to the sites, and each site has a custom stamp, and you get discounts on admission. And if you accumulate enough stamps, you can enter to win cash prizes throughout the year. We had someone come in today who had 17 stamps in their passport already, and it's only been out since November 11th. So maybe that's a sign of success, and people will be crisscrossing the Commonwealth. The other announcement came out just a couple of days ago, and we're also quite proud to share that the VMHC, as part of our 250th programming, is establishing, and believe it or not, in nearly 200 years, our first ever major history prize, the Commonwealth Prize, as it will be called. This is intended to recognize generational contributions to the study of history and the culture of the Commonwealth and immense and lasting patriotic service. So this will be given out on rare occasion, but for those deserving, and we're really proud to have announced that the first recipient of the Commonwealth Prize will be Ken Burns. Hopefully you're watching his American Revolution series on TV right now. When I was with him just a couple of months ago, he described it as his lasting passion project. He's been wanting to do this for 10 years and has now pulled it off and just in time for the 250th. It's a 12-hour series that is live right now, and you can watch it on your streaming device and PBS. But I think it's a really great testament to a fresh look at the American Revolution, a complete telling of this compelling story, and we're really proud that we'll have him here following the series to receive the prize in February. And tickets, by the way, are still available, but maybe not for long. So that's my two announcements this evening, but stay tuned, much more coming on the 250th. This next 6 months will be some of the liveliest in the very long history of this institution, and it should be. So this evening, and I said one of our own, and I said that with purpose. As many of you know, our speaker tonight is no stranger to the VMHC. For 30 years, Dr. Nelson Lankford edited our beloved quarterly journal, the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography, which is one of the longest consecutively published historical journals in the United States of America. He retired in 2014, so sadly we missed each other just by that much, as vice president for programs. He's the author or editor of 8 books, best known, which is Richmond Burning, The Last Days of the Confederate Capital, a great read. And of course, tonight's lecture will focus on the sequel to that work, After the Fire, Richmond in Defeat. It was published just this fall. After the Fire continues the story of the city and its people in the aftermath of war and devastation. And as he brings his deeply researched and eloquent style, then I know you'll enjoy this piece and you'll enjoy his lecture this evening. Dr. Lankford is a native of Hampton, Virginia. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Richmond and his PhD and his MBA from Indiana University, Bloomington. But most importantly, truly most importantly, he is an exceptionally talented and deeply respected scholar throughout Virginia and in our nation, and he is a very dear friend to many of us here at the VMHC. I really thank you all for your support of this institution, for being here this evening, and I hope you'll join me now in a very warm welcome for one of our own, Nelson Lankford.
Thanks so much, Jamie. Thanks so much, Jamie, for that warm introduction, and thank all of you for coming out this evening. The first slide shows Richmond the first week after the Great Fire. After the Fire is the story of Richmond and its people for the first year after the fire and a little bit later, but mainly the first year. It was a time of, it was a vanished world of defeat and jubilation, of destruction and rebuilding, and of enduring racial divide. The first year was marked by 2 strikingly different events that contrasted the ways the black and white communities remember the war and interpret it for the future. But first, because as Jamie said, this is a sequel to Richmond Burning, let's burn the city down again. You all know this Currier and Ives print. It's fanciful, but it shows the evacuation fire on the night of April the 2nd, 3rd, 1865. On April the 3rd, the Southern government abandoned its capital. The Confederate Army retreats. Confederate soldiers set fire to the warehouses and bridges. The Union Army marches in. Slavery ends. And Abraham Lincoln himself walks through the smoking ruins. And that happened all in 48 hours. At dawn on Monday, April the 3rd, a strong wind blew flaming embers across the doomed wooden rooftops of factories and dwellings. Residents sought shelter on the green of Capitol Square. Frank Lawley, a correspondent with the London Times, was here. His last column quoted Shakespeare's Tempest. Hell is empty and all the devils are here. There we go. Elizabeth Van Lew, Union spy. She watched the fire from her mansion on Church Hill. She said, "The inferno filled the sky with clouds of smoke as incense from the land for its deliverance. What a moment. Avenging wrath appeased in flames." Confederate artillery officer Porter Alexander watched from the temporary safety of the south bank of the river. He had a different opinion. "It was a sad, a terrible, and solemn sight," he wrote years later, with a detachment that he couldn't have felt at the time. "I rode on with a distinctly heavy heart and a peculiar sort of feeling of orphanage." Journalist Thomas Morris Chester marched in with regiments of the United States Colored Troops, the USCTs. In a dispatch to his Philadelphia newspaper, he marveled at, quote, "the great concourse of American citizens of African descent who welcomed their liberators." Garland White had fled slavery, but returned that day as a chaplain with a USCT regiment. like these men. When they reached the western edge of town, his comrades asked him to speak to the freed people who gathered around. He got as far as pronouncing freedom to all mankind before choking up with emotion. And then some soldiers brought an old woman from the crowd to speak to him. After quizzing him, she said, "This is your mother, Garland, who has spent 20 years worrying with great grief about her son." I didn't believe that when I first read it, but I found that he wrote that story in a letter to the editor to a Philadelphia newspaper 1 week after the event. Union soldiers would argue for years to come about who raised the first flag over the state capitol. In fact, it wasn't a soldier in blue who raised that first flag. It was a pale-skinned, biracial Richmond youth, Richard Gill Forrester. That morning, there was the fire of Richmond, but there was no Battle of Richmond. The Union Army marched in unopposed. General Godfrey Weitzel led his men into the city. He took up a position on the portico of the Capitol. One of his staff said they looked down on a gigantic crater of fire. One Confederate woman said, "It was my idea of the Day of Judgment. I feel as if God had hidden his face from us as a nation." By afternoon, the spans of the railroad bridges were dropping into the river with great hissing splashes. The fire died out by evening. That night, a secessionist editor wrote bitterly, "A strange quiet fell upon the blackened city, the quiet of a great desolation." And here are tobacco factories where the Confederates first fired the tobacco, and the fire spread from here. In the following weeks, photographers swarmed over the city. They captured the ruins in hundreds of glass plate negatives. From 8th Street to 15th Street, all you could see were blackened walls and smoking ruins. April the 3rd overshadowed everything that had come before in our city's history, and it influenced everything that followed for years to come. One of my favorite pictures shows Union cavalry horses tied up to the railing at the base of Capitol Square, facing the burnt district. And I'm sure have all seen this image of two women in deep mourning dress gliding past the ruin. Union topographical engineers began to draw this map even before the fires had cooled. You can see Capitol Square in the middle. There's the Capitol and the curved paths through the gardens of Capitol Square. And down below, all these squares in undifferentiated gray mark the burned area. It was the area that people were already calling the burnt district. But only 1/10 of the built-up area of the city burned. However, that constituted 9/10 of the jobs and the wealth, and they all went up in smoke. Richmond faced the daunting task of rebuilding because of lack of capital and also uncertainty about ownership of property. And the earliest economic activity was not the most desirable: saloons, gambling dens, and brothels. Not surprisingly, crime increased. More grievous than the material loss was human loss. Across the state, 40,000 Virginians died. That was 3% of the total population. For weeks, a demographic flux characterized the city. Confederate veterans flooded in to seek transport home to other southern states, like these lounging around the base of the Washington statue on Capitol Square. Black people streamed in too, like this family sitting on the banks of the canal. They came in search of food, of jobs, and of family members separated by the slave auctions of Richmond. April 1865 brought not just physical destruction, but a complete upending of society. a great inversion of the way Richmonders viewed their city. It meant great uncertainty for white Confederates, for white Unionists, and for black people. Who would rule in the Virginia capital? What rights could the formerly enslaved expect? And what terrible verdict from the triumphant North awaited the defeated Confederates? This is a time of great antagonism between the majority Confederates and the minority white Unionists, friction between the Army and local elites, and discord between black and white Richmonders. Former Governor and rebel General Henry Alexander Wise spoke for many Confederates. His hard features gave him the look of a dangerous man. He was erratic, conceited, slovenly. He dribbled tobacco juice down the front of his shirt as he spoke. But he was a politician of undeniable charm and hypnotic power. He'd hang John Brown at Harper's Ferry and almost single-handedly dragged Virginia out of the Union. A Union chaplain quizzed him at the Appomattox surrender. When Wise denied he'd helped bring on the war, the chaplain said he deserved to hang. "You cannot subjugate us," Wise shot back. "God is with us. The great heart of the South remains unconquered." The most bitter opponent of Northern victory was Edmund Ruffin. This long-haired apostle of secession had fired the signal cannon to begin the war at Fort Sumter 4 years before. In his last diary entry, he declared his unmitigated hatred to Yankee rule. With that angry benediction, he put his mouth over the barrel of his rifle and with a forked stick depressed the trigger. The small number of white Unionists in Richmond feared being overwhelmed in peacetime by former Confederates. Former Congressman John Minor Botts was a large man. He had a massive head and a bombastic style of speaking and writing. He'd graced the Confederate jail for his Unionist sentiments. When told he should work with former Confederates to rebuild the state government, he wrote, "They and I can never, never, never be politically associated together." During the war, an alternative state government domiciled in Northern Virginia and loyal to Washington waited for the chance to come to Richmond. The governor was Francis Pierpont Harrison. A shrewd lawyer, he despised slaveholding aristocrats. He led the effort to separate the mountain counties from the Confederate East and create West Virginia. His government arrived in Richmond in May. It rested on a small number of white Unionists. Remember, at this point, black people were still excluded from politics. Pierpont hoped to bring together the white factions, Unionists and Confederates. He tried to create a middle way between extremes, but he didn't reckon on the powerful hatreds that made that goal unlikely. If he'd had the gift of prophecy, he might not have come to Richmond. On the national scene, no one knew what President Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction policy would be. At first, it seemed ominous for Confederates. 6 weeks after Lincoln's inauguration, Johnson issued a proclamation. It pardoned ordinary Confederates if they took an oath of allegiance. But it also excluded from that generosity all prominent Confederates and anyone worth $20,000. That sent a shiver down the spine of Southern elites. Moreover, 2 days after Johnson's proclamation, the first efforts to indict leading Confederates and confiscate their property rocked the Richmond establishment. That effort was led by John Underwood. Before the war, he'd earned notoriety as one of the few Virginians to support Lincoln. This disheveled federal judge became the most hated figure in the ample demonology of white Richmonders. While they feared for their property, black Richmonders feared for their freedom. Will the promise of emancipation be denied to them? What prompted that fear was the reinstatement of Mayor Joseph Carrington Mayo. He was a stiff autocrat whose out-of-date fashion sense matched his antiquated opinions. Mayo restored the whipping post for minor offenses. His pass system required black people to carry a pass signed by a white person. In response, a black delegation even went to the White House to protest. Mayo was removed from office, and at the same time, the Army appointed a new general for Virginia, Alfred Terry. He showed more sympathy to black citizens. He ended the hated pass system and declared, quote, "People of color will henceforth enjoy the same personal liberty which other citizens and inhabitants enjoy." But could he enforce that statement? The first 4th of July after the fire illustrated the divisions between black and white Richmonders. The Army organized a parade down Broad Street to Capitol Square with brass bands and artillery salutes. At the square, Dr. Mary Walker read the Declaration of Independence. She was a pioneering woman physician, but she was better known for promoting comfortable fashions for women. Most of those who attended the ceremony were black. White Richmonders pointedly stayed away and did not hear Dr. Walker speak. A sharp change of fortune for white Richmonders came by the end of the summer when Andrew Johnson made a stunning reversal in his policy. Here he is again. Whoops. Still looking sour. Earlier, he burned with a poor man's hatred of the Southern white elite, but he came to realize he needed them if he wanted to be reelected in his own right, elected in his own right. So he began to issue individual pardons wholesale to Confederates, to all those Confederate grandees who feared expropriation of their property. His change emboldened them and threatened to dash the hopes of the freed people. This change in policy, however, was a tonic for rebuilding, especially for the Holy Trinity. I mean iron, flour, and tobacco production. Joseph Reed Anderson was one of the main beneficiaries of Johnson's change of policy. He was a Confederate general whose Tredegar Iron Works made cannons for the Confederacy. I doubt if he wore that uniform when he went to the White House to ask for a pardon. With a pardon in hand, Anderson rebuilt Tredegar into the largest employer in the city. Another who received the coveted pardon was James Thomas Jr. There's Tredegar. And here's James Thomas Jr. looking almost cherubic in this pre-war daguerreotype, holding the source of his wealth, a sheaf of tobacco leaves and a plug of chewing tobacco. His factories made him the richest man in the city before the war. A lot of his property went up in smoke, but he quickly rebuilt his factories and his fortune. In all, by December, workers had put 120 new buildings under construction. But recall that hundreds had burned, maybe as many as 1,000. As rebuilding the burnt district began, the black population developed a parallel society. They emerged from the shadow of slavery with a network of institutions, the family, the church, and an array of self-help organizations. The black church was the central backbone of this phenomenon. In Richmond, the leading example was First African Baptist Church on Broad Street. With its network of contacts beyond the city, it helped reunite families. With its schools, it supported the universal thirst for education that showed itself in the first weeks after the fire. Another school for black children was at Chimborazo, the former Confederate military hospital complex east of town. These schools attracted teachers from the north. like Edmonia Lewis. She was an accomplished African-American sculptor who rocketed to fame in northern abolition circles. Only 21 years old, she put her career on hold in August to come to Richmond to teach newly freed children. In frustration, though, she left for Europe after only a few weeks. She lamented that, quote, the land of liberty had no room for a colored sculptor. Congressional elections in the fall prefigured conflict to come. And I show this picture of the Capitol. It looks like a modern photograph, but this is from 1867. The Capitol was just completed. The dome was just completed, and the Statue of Freedom was placed on the top. Many southern states sent former Confederates as representatives to Washington. Virginia was not that blatant, but Congress refused to seat any southern congressman, and that meant Virginia would have no voice in Washington as Republicans increasingly clashed with the Johnson administration. But affairs at the state and local level were different, in marked contrast to the national scene, because the Army gradually ceded authority back to the old order on Richmond City Council. And in elections to the General Assembly, voters returned men who represented the former establishment. In Richmond, Governor Pierpont's middle way, always a sickly plant, withered and died. The divisions in society and the futility of Pierpont's position were on display at a reception at the governor's mansion in February. This image is actually from the previous April. Members of the conservative establishment attended, like former Mayor Joseph Mayo, but also present were their antagonists, like General Terry and some of the white Unionists. I just imagine what their conversations must have been like, trying to be civil to one another under the governor's glittering gas-lit chandeliers. A larger group of Richmonders were not even invited, and they meant to be heard. In January, the black community began planning a parade to mark the anniversary of April 3rd, 1865. Newspapers warned them against offending their white employers. Some of those employers threatened to fire any worker who participated in the parade. In response, the organizing committee distributed this poster around town. It read, "The colored people of the city of Richmond would most respectfully inform the public that they do not intend to celebrate the failure of the Southern Confederacy, as it has been stated in the papers of this city, but simply as the day on which God was pleased to liberate their long oppressed race." An unequivocal answer to the poster came 3 days before the parade, when arsonists burned down the Second African Baptist Church where the parade was being planned. Despite this sinister warning, the parade came off as planned. 10,000 spectators queued to watch. First in the line of march came 60 black men in uniform. More than 1,000 marchers followed. They represented the charitable societies that African Americans had founded in secret before the war and expanded in the years since. The parade ended at the Washington statue on Capitol Square, where the crowd heard speeches from their leaders. The keynote speaker, James Honeycutt, was a Baptist minister and newspaper editor with a grim-faced and alarming hairstyle. His newspaper, The New Nation, was the only journal in town to speak for equal rights for all citizens without regard to race. But if they asked a white man to give the main address, the organizers made sure to include other speakers of their own race, including the Reverend Peter Randolph. He had been born into slavery in Virginia, but was manumitted and went north. He returned after the fire as pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church. A heckler in the crowd demanded to know what his policy was. Unruffled, Randolph smoothly replied, "Peace and goodwill to all men." Another event offered a different perspective a few weeks later. That happened when the white women of Richmond established the Ladies' Memorial Associations, one for Oakwood Cemetery and one for Hollywood Cemetery. It was no fluke that the women held their first remembrance ceremonies right after the Black Parade. Another factor prompted the women to act. The federal government began creating national cemeteries in Virginia. They were meant to honor the soldiers in blue, but barring those cemeteries to the remains of Southern soldiers implied they were without honor, and that implication rankled. These carefully designed cemeteries like this one put to shame the pitiful state of Confederate soldiers' graves where rude wooden headboards rotted in the heavy Virginia clay. Despite lack of money, the Ladies' Memorial Associations were determined to correct the neglect. The first Confederate Memorial Day at Hollywood took place on May 31st, 1866. A majority of white Richmonders participated. They formed a slow procession through the cemetery behind a brass band. 23 militia companies marched as units. Some even carried Confederate flags. The catharsis of this shared experience renewed their hope for the future. That first Confederate Memorial Day began the long romance of commemoration that defined white Richmonders' devotion to the Southern cause. These two different emblematic ways of remembering the war, the Black Parade emphasizing emancipation and the white commemoration of Southern dead, coupled with support for the Confederacy, set the stage for conflicting interpretations of the past for years to come. Later that summer, secessionist editor Edward Pollard, tempestuous, prone to violence, and tetchy about honor, gave a name to Confederate defiance with his book. Long awaited, The Lost Cause narrated the rise and fall of the Southern Republic, down to its fiery Richmond-centric ending on April 3rd, 1865. On that day, Pollard wrote, "All the hopes of the Southern Confederacy were consumed like a scroll in the fire." He championed the righteousness of the Confederacy, the superiority of the South, and the correctness of white man's rule. If the journalist gave the cause a name with his eponymous title, Governor Wise gave it eloquent voice. Defiant, theatrical, and unrepentant, Wise spoke at a reunion of the Richmond Light Infantry Blues Militia the same time as the first Confederate Memorial Day. He proclaimed the Southern cause was, quote, "the cause of civil and constitutional liberty, which must and will be victorious throughout the United States." At the same time that Wise and Pollard looked to the past and promoted the lost cause in summer 1866, rebuilding and cultural change accelerated in the city. This, after all, was a summer of great excitement. It was excitement about the first transatlantic telegraph cable. It was the internet or the AI of the age. It was the summer when the craze for the new sport of baseball first swept through Richmond, and police had to shoo kids off the streets to keep them from playing in the roads. And it was the summer when pride swelled over the extensive rebuilding, such as the first modern iron front buildings like these on Main Street. The Richmond Tobacco Exchange was founded. The Chamber of Commerce was founded. The rebuilt bridge for the Richmond and Petersburg Railroad opened. The Medical College of Virginia graduated its first class. Now I realize the Egyptian building was built before the war, but this was the center for MCV. And the guiding light for MCV's revival was Dr. Hunter Holmes McGuire. The theater revived too. the legitimate theater, not just the slapstick vaudeville acts that had cropped up right after the fire. Ida Vernon was the darling of the Confederate stage. She'd watched her house burn on April the 3rd and went on to a 6-decade career, mainly in New York. But she often returned to Richmond to play, where she'd been the happiest. Despite the energy apparent in rebuilding the city and its social and cultural institution, uncertainty about politics persisted. Now, some head-spinning changes took place over the next year or so hold on to your hats. First, Congress passed a series of Reconstruction Acts. These divided the former Confederate states into 5 military districts. Virginia had the distinction of being military district number 1 all by itself. The Reconstruction Acts mandated referendums for state constitutional conventions. In Richmond, the election generated great enthusiasm among the black population. It was the first time black men could vote. A lecture at the state capitol during the campaign illustrated how much times had changed. Abolitionist Frances Harper spoke in the hall of the House of Delegates. Her lecture asserted that the great social changes the nation had just experienced were incomplete until America was truly colorblind. Her presence in the Capitol represented a remarkable development. 2 months after Harper spoke, Richmonders voted to call the Constitutional Convention. The enthusiasm of black people and the indifference of white people determined the outcome. Radicals won all 5 districts in the city and a majority statewide. The result belatedly galvanized white Richmonders to form the what would Dr. Freud say about that? The Conservative Party. But they were too late to alter the composition of the convention. Delegates elected Judge Underwood, the scourge of white Richmond, as the president of the convention. It drafted a remarkably forward-looking document. It provided for a strong governor, votes for black men, and free public schools. But it also barred Confederate veterans from voting. Now, another twist of fortune came next. I can get it to advance. With John Schofield. He was the conservative general in charge of Military District Number 1, and he refused to let the draft Constitution be put to a vote. So Virginia continued in political limbo for another year. That state of suspended animation couldn't last. It prolonged the uncertainty that hung over politics. It denied African Americans their rights. It was bad for business. The next year, a compromise grand bargain broke the impasse. Under it, the new Constitution was finally approved in revised form. It now said that all men, black as well as white, including Confederate veterans, could vote and stand for office. So a half loaf for each side. The first election under the new Constitution chose a conservative Republican as governor, Gilbert Walker, and conservative dominance of the General Assembly, but black men now sat in the legislature. I'll end with the example of one family that showed the complexity of the society Richmond inherited from the pre-war era. Gustavus Adolphus Myers had helped build Richmond as an enterprising lawyer and company director. He'd sat on city council for 3 decades. He was president of 2 Jewish congregations and was a leader of this institution, the former Virginia Historical Society. But it was in his person, more than in any civic role, that Myers most intimately embodied the legacy of slavery. Remember that biracial youth who raised the first American flag over the Capitol? He was Myers' grandson. As a young man, Myers had formed a relationship with a free woman of color, Nellie Forrester. They produced a son, Richard Gustavus Forrester. And it was his son who raised the first flag on April the 3rd, 1865. Forrester, the father, this man, was a founding member of the Colored Men's Equal Suffrage League. He served on the city school board, and he was a marshal in the parade that recognized passage of the 15th Amendment that enshrined in the U.S. Constitution the right of black men to vote. 5 years had now passed since the Great Fire. Since then, Richmond had changed beyond all recognition. This skyline from the early 1870s shows how comprehensively the burnt district had been rebuilt. No more fields of ash. The city changed not just in its physical aspect, of course. The demons unleashed by racial animosity augured ill for the future. But if we want to understand the people of our city in the first years after the war, we should keep this in mind. They couldn't see the grimmer future that followed later in the century. Jim Crow legislation, disfranchisement, and all the rest. The first election under the new Constitution restored the traditional establishment in the city and the state, but it didn't undo the enormous strides African Americans had made over their past circumstances. Now they could own property, sit on juries, vote, and run for office. Though in a minority, 29 black men served in the new General Assembly. It's important to remember that brief period of fragile but hopeful biracial democracy. None of those Richmonders, black or white, knew what would happen next in their own time, any more than we can know what will happen next in our own day. Thank you very much. Questions? Don't be shy.
Hi. I just moved here from Massachusetts, and so I'm learning an awful lot about Richmond, both before and after the fire. How did the sort of residential neighborhoods change after the fire? Did they become more integrated, or did blacks and whites live separately? Were there like people working side by side in jobs, or was employment also very segregated?
That's a good question. The neighborhoods gradually became more segregated, but for a while, black people and white people lived and worked close at hand. So it did not look like, say, the city of 1900, where the neighborhoods had become more separated.
I remember stories about Elizabeth Van Loo, which I only remember, not everything, but she was postmistress of Richmond, was she not?
Yes, she was.
At some point, and I remember either hearing or reading that she was so despised by Richmonders for being a spy for the Union Army, that when her father died, they didn't have enough friends left to even have pallbearers at his funeral. Now, is that something I dreamed, or can you? I just think she's such a fascinating.
Yeah, you
person.
may have dreamed that, but that story is in the book. I think her niece complained that she was so disliked that they couldn't find enough white pallbearers. She was an outcast. And she was the postmistress of Richmond. Grant appointed her. And, the conservative local leaders grudgingly realized or admitted that she improved the efficiency of the post office. But that wasn't enough because she'd been a spy.
In your first book, Richmond Burning, you briefly talk about how some of the Confederate generals were considering either not abandoning the city or continuing some form of guerrilla warfare. Why didn't they, while the fleeing Confederate government tried to relocate to what was parts of Georgia and Florida that were still under Confederate control?
There was some talk about, do we continue the fight? And remember that there was even after Lee surrendered, there was another Confederate army still in the field under Joe Johnston in North Carolina, and more, maybe 100,000 Confederates under arms in the parts of the South that were not yet occupied. But Lee was not interested in guerrilla warfare, and so it wasn't seriously considered. There was talk, but it wasn't seriously considered as an option.
Can I ask you to go forward a few decades? Go forward a few decades, Dr. Lankford. The monuments on Monument Avenue that are now gone, it's often said that some people say they were put up as part of a real estate scheme, and others argue that this was an attempt to support Jim Crow and so forth and terrorize the black population. How do you see the construction of those monuments?
The monuments were put up much later, and they were to glorify the lost cause of the Confederacy. It's funny that in the very first weeks after the fire, there was a proposal for a monument in the very first few weeks. But it was a proposal from white Unionists to erect a monument to the perfidy of the Confederates. And the newspaper editor said, well, there's really no need for that. All you need to do is the monument to the perfidy of the Confederates is all around us. Just look at the acres of ashes. And of course, they didn't last that long. But you're right, the Confederate monuments came later, and they were consciously designed to promote, to glorify the Confederacy.
Can you talk a little bit about the photographers who came into the city to take pictures after the fire? And I'm thinking in particular of Brady's picture of Lee and his sons on the back porch.
Matthew Brady and Timothy Sullivan and others came to Richmond within the first week, and they missed by one day taking a picture of Lincoln addressing freedmen at the base of the Washington statue on Capitol Square. They got here the next day, which was a great, one of the great might-have-beens. But they, the glass plate negatives were big, and they had the Union Army. There were photographers with the Union Army. They had mobile dark rooms, so they were right there. They could come in fairly quickly. But this was the big story. I mean, for the North, the images of the burning of Richmond, of the remnants of the fire, it was reinforced their sense of victory, and so everybody wanted pictures of burnt Richmond, and they took something like 300 glass plate negatives. One of my favorite ones, I used this when I gave a talk on Richmond burning. They took a picture, and then they moved the camera a little bit and took another one. They took 5 pictures, so it was a panorama, and with Photoshop and PowerPoint, you can stitch them together and create a video of the cityscape of Richmond. But the image I showed at the beginning, it's not a photograph, it's the Courier and Ives. Prints of that used to hang above mantelpieces in Richmond within living memory.
You showed a picture of a publication with the title "The Lost Cause," and your description of the events and the people make it sound like there was no second thoughts among the conservatives or the white Richmonders. Was that uniform true, or were there some people thinking, this whole thing was a mistake?
Well, there was a minority of white Richmonders who were unionists. They were very quiet, and it was still, it was a small minority. I think if you look at the vote for the Constitutional Convention, there were 10,000 votes cast. There were, I think, 50 votes for the radical candidates. 50 votes of white people were cast for the radical candidates, which shows how limited the union support was in the city.
I have a question about a map. I have a question about a map that is in the Fan District book, and it was by, I believe, Major Mitchie. Is that correct? And it shows he was sent to Richmond from the U.S. Geological Survey or somewhere to do this extensive map after the war in 1866 of the whole of the city of Richmond. In this photograph in the book, it's only sections, but it shows battlements. It shows where the future Monument Avenue is. Do you know anything about that map? And is it here at the Historical Society?
The map that I showed, the slide I had, is a detail from Peter Mickey's map. He was became a general, the topographical engineers, and they started, people started to see him and his team around town making measurements very soon after the fire. The map wasn't finished until 1867, but it showed the whole built-up area of the city and even part of the unbuilt-up area around it. I think it's at the Library of Congress, either the Library of Congress or the National Archives. I think we have copies of it in the archives. Huh, not sure.
I know.
I've been retired for 13 years.
Could you talk a little bit about those 2 tense years when Davis was in prison at Fortress Monroe and the great anticipation of the trial and all the folks who raised bail to bail him out? And that was a big moment in Richmond.
Well, the government didn't know what to do with Jefferson Davis. Right before the end, before Richmond fell, when Lincoln came down to confer with Grant at his headquarters at City Point, now Hopewell, he actually hinted, the subject came up of what are we going to do with the rebel leaders, and he actually hinted that, well, maybe it'd be better if we'd let them get away so we didn't have to deal with them. But that didn't happen. They captured him in Georgia and imprisoned him for 2 years. Davis was not very popular in Richmond by the end of his time here. In fact, when Lincoln came to Richmond the day after the fire, a crowd gathered around him, mainly freed people, and on the fringes of the crowd, people shouted, "The president has returned." And people thought it was Davis, and so they began to say, "Hang him, hang him." So he was not popular at the end, but the federal government made the mistake of keeping him in jail so long, not knowing what to do with him, because he began to generate more sympathy being in jail. So 2 years later, in spring of '67, a number of mainly northern men put up $5,000 apiece, like 20 of them, to bail him. The government agreed that they would let him out on bail. So they raised the money, and he got out of prison. He went to Canada. He wasn't free. The government, the possibility of the trial still hung over him, but by letting him out, everybody knew that he would never be brought to trial. And then he went eventually back to Mississippi and wrote 2 turgid, self-serving books about his time as president.
I'm going to ask you to speculate if the Union or the United States had buried the Confederate dead in a more dignified manner, would the Daughters of the Confederacy, promoted the lost cause?
That's a great question, and it's a counterfactual one. We don't know the answer, but if that had happened, if they'd buried Southern as well as Northern soldiers, that would have eliminated one of the sources of irritation on the part of the former Confederates, but I doubt if it would. The antagonisms were too strong. Even if they said, okay, that's nice, they allow us to bury the Southern boys in these national cemeteries, but I don't think that would have changed people's hearts that much. But your guess is as good as mine.
Hi. Did the Tregidor Iron Works survive and produce armaments for the Union or for the country moving forward, or because of the Confederate nature of the ownership did it die out?
Tregidor actually survived the fire. The fire came right up close to the edge of the property, but Tregidor didn't burn. All the windows got blown out when the arsenal blew up, but the factories and forges survived, so it was easy to start up again. They didn't make armaments afterwards. They made mainly boilers and railroad ties and iron for the railroads. And it was the largest employer in the city, employing both black and white. And Anderson said that he paid both races equally.
One thing I would love for you to talk about, even though it's a little bit outside your talk, is my understanding is that the fire destroyed enormous quantities of historic documents in the state of Virginia.
Yeah.
Is that right? And how severe was that loss?
You're absolutely right. This is unintended consequences. During the war, the Confederate government encouraged county courthouses to send their documents to Richmond for safekeeping. You can guess what happened. They stored them in a building that burned, and so there are a lot of what are called burnt counties where the documents went up in smoke.
Well, thank you, everybody. Nelson will be upstairs signing copies of his book, so please come up.